Welcome to Key Concepts in Digital Processing. This training was produced by the State Electronic Records Initiative in coordination with the Council of State Archivists. Its purpose is to help archivists and other professionals who maintain electronic records understand the important processes and steps that records must go through in order to preserve them indefinitely. In this video, we'll cover a definition of digital processing, its goals, and some of the practicalities and tools. Many of these themes will be covered in more depth in future videos. We hope that this video not only helps you understand the risks facing electronic records and how to combat that risk, but also demonstrates the importance of the unique technology needed to preserve records. We hope this video will give you the information you need to become equipped to preserve electronic records for the long term. We'd like to begin by talking about the core elements of digital processing. Most records do not arrive at the archives in a condition ideal for long-term preservation and access. Thus, some steps must be taken to identify, organize, and further add descriptive information to records to ensure their efficient and effective preservation. Processing typically occurs after archival materials are taken into the custody of an archives, and usually involves some key high-level steps: identification or surveying, arrangement, description, and preservation. First, identification or surveying involves developing an understanding of the records and their provenance. For digital records, a survey includes identifying file formats, file sizes, directory structures, and screening for sensitive information. The survey should be thorough enough to discover any potential preservation issues such that they can be planned for and addressed. Arrangement is the logical ordering of records that, while respecting their original order, has the goal of enhancing future user access. An archivist may desire to keep a detailed list of actions taken on records, which can aid future understanding of how records came to their current state. Description aids in discovery, access, and preservation activities in the future. It involves the preservation or supplementing of contextual information, including file and series-level metadata. Sets of digital records, or mixed sets comprising both digital and analog records, can be extraordinarily complex in structure, nature of technical specifications, and content, and thus great care must be taken to ensure that the provenance and context of the records is preserved through time. Description can also be very time-consuming, and thus varying levels of detail may be appropriate. Finally, digital preservation is closely intertwined with processing. One might say that the seeds of long-term preservation are planted and cultivated during processing. Preservation can be broken into two main categories: actions taken immediately to secure and preserve the record's content and context, and long-term planning for future preservation activities to account for the changing nature of computing environments in the future. Preservation activities may include file format normalization or migration, according to policy decisions, generation of access copies, to leave preservation copies secure and untouched, moving files to a new storage medium periodically, and preservation of the original bit stream. Processing procedures should be tied directly to the same principles outlined in records management best practices, as preparing records for their final disposition as part of the record-keeping lifecycle. Digital processing will be the last opportunity, say future reprocessing, to save or rebuild context, relationships, provenance, and other information that gives archival records their enduring value. Furthermore, data will only be lost over time. If careful planning and thorough practices are not observed at this stage, future goals will become difficult or impossible. The ISO 15489 standard for records management defines the concepts and principles that inform the creation, capture, and management of records. The principles laid out in this standard will inform your processing procedures, documentation, and policies. It defines 4 dimensions to trustworthy records: authenticity, integrity, reliability, and accessibility or usability. We will discuss each of these in more detail. Authenticity is essential for public records, which are often used in evidentiary and legal proceedings and thus must be unimpeachable as legal instruments. One tried and true method to do so is to closely preserve the chain of custody. This step involves careful attention to both technical and procedural factors involved in transferring records from one custodian to another. Before transfer, a technician can create checksums or hashes for digital records. A checksum is a unique short set of letters and numbers that are generated when a hash algorithm is run over the file, and serves as a sort of fingerprint of the file. If even a single bit of a file is altered, the checksum algorithm will produce a different hash. Thus, validating checksums before and after a transfer and periodically over time, otherwise known as checking the file's fixity, is a way to ensure that the file has not changed. Additionally, ensuring proper chain of custody procedures, including transfer checklists, agreements, manifests, and logs, all signed and dated by proper authorities, ensures that the authenticity of records from creation to disposition and preservation is completely unimpeachable. However, authenticity is not fully guaranteed by strong transfer procedures alone. It is supported by information about the record's context in their original use, their purpose, and their context of creation. If information about the origins and purpose of records is lost, the long-term value will suffer. For this reason, archivists will refer to the principle of original order. Records, especially digital records, are connected by context. Many electronic records are stored in fragmentary methods and require careful preservation of their contextual relationships as much as the underlying bits of the files. Finally, transparency in processes is vital to authenticity, so that during transfers and while in a repository's custody, the actions taken on digital records are well documented. Business rules, workflows, and policies that are well circulated, documentation of decisions taken and why, all support transparency so that the record's status as authentic, being what it purports to be, is not under question. An example is doing some kind of file list or directory prints of materials to record the state of files at a given time. E.g., in manifest before transfer, a file list is part of the metadata after processing. The greatest technical challenge of digital processing is ensuring that records do not change over time, and records and digital data generally are most vulnerable when copied or accessed outside of digital preservation systems. Thus, the challenge of preserving the integrity of digital records is ensuring that from the beginning of the transfer process to the end of processing, not a single bit is changed unintentionally, that the records are complete and unaltered. There are many techniques used to accomplish this task. Preserving file fixity regularly with checksums, scanning viruses to eliminate unauthorized alterations, tracing digital provenance to preserve the completeness of the data's context, or file format validation if it is a type that can be validated. In the long term, computing environments will change and archivists will need to determine what the significant properties of the records are that need to be carried forward. What is the difference between a .pdf and a .doc? How can these be migrated to other future-compatible formats while still preserving the essence of the record, ensuring that small, sometimes hidden artifacts are carried forward? While migration is important over the long term, so is being able to verify and document the transformation while still presenting a faithful rendition of the record's original context. And finally, the formats and data structures commonly in use have and will go through many versions and revisions. Careful tracking of versions, especially for frequently updated software, can prevent loss of data when features are removed or altered between versions. Reliable record-keeping processes faithfully transmit information about what actually happened. Reliability is supported by information about the record's creation context. Who was the creator? When was it created? What were the systems or work processes that went into the activity being documented? If record-keeping processes regularly omit information or have gaps, users further down the line will find the records less trustworthy. Thus, as mentioned before, gathering and maintaining robust metadata about provenance and context is key in digital processing. This contextual information must be preserved along with the record itself. Separation of a record from its context damages our ability to trust or make relevant the information contained within. Furthermore, over time, reliability is maintained by robust documentation of preservation and archival activities surrounding the files. Any actions and agents must be logged and documented. Knowing when records were received, ingested, modified, and more allows for a clear evidentiary trail that leaves no questions. Finally, ensuring that records are as complete and information about them is as accurate as possible will aid users in being able to trust records as reliable evidence. Some records will come to the archives already incomplete. During processing, one must identify where there are gaps or unreliable information and seek to address or at least be transparent about these gaps. All of this information can be contained in thoughtful and concise metadata. This metadata can be derived from many sources. For example, there may be documentation provided by the creator or other transfer paperwork, and research performed by the archivist. It can also be extracted from file metadata if it exists, e.g. the user account that created it, the creation and modification dates, the system, software, equipment that created it. Accessibility of digital records includes the ability to present and interpret a file or set of files. Unlike human-readable records, machine-readable records can be more vulnerable to neglect, as there are many factors that must be in place to render the bits that make up a file. A paper record can be kept in climate-controlled storage for many, many years and age gracefully. However, a digital file may be inaccessible within a few years if the storage media on which it resides becomes degraded, if the technology to read the storage media is no longer available, or if the software and other dependencies to interpret the file are obsolete. Thus, it is crucial to consider the long-term viability of the hardware on which files reside, and the software that is and will be used to render the file. Whether during the initial processing or as part of the long-term preservation planning, file formats may be converted to a format that is more open, well-documented, and widely used. At the least, the archivist will monitor the file formats present in the repository and assess them for risk of obsolescence. It is inevitable that the time will come where files can no longer be represented faithfully in their original formats. One solution to this problem is migration, converting files from one format to another. This does change the file, and there will always be some degree of loss. However, that degree can be minimized and doesn't require discarding the original file, which can still be preserved bit for bit, but allows a more effective user experience. Lastly, there are some records for which any change to the file or format would damage its value. For many government records, the program or file type has small relevance, but for more artistic or stylistic endeavors, or those for whom the format or environment played a meaningful role, attempts can be made to duplicate that environment through the use of virtual machines, dedicated workstations, or emulators. In addition to being able to use records, users must also be able to quickly and reliably find records. As with analog records, discoverability, being able to locate and retrieve a record, is all about metadata. A processing archivist will enhance and generate several kinds of metadata for the digital records, which will be key for discovery and access by all stakeholders, both internal and external. Each institution will have its standards and procedures about what metadata to capture and what to make publicly available. Administrative metadata is information vital to the management of resources, including acquisition, rights, and preservation metadata, such as identifiers and checksums. Descriptive metadata supports discovery and identification. Technical metadata includes information about the resources needed to render a file or about its creation. Structural metadata describes the relationships of compound objects, for example, scan pages of a book that compose a single intellectual object. These metadata can, combined with the record itself, paint a complete picture about the record's creation, context, use, disposition, and preservation. As much of this metadata should be collected from the record's creator as possible. Metadata can be contained in file systems, records management systems, and frameworks, in the properties of the file itself, and in manifests, logs, and other supplementary records. During processing, this information should be filtered, checked for accuracy and completeness, and make its way to the final product if it provides additional information about the record. As you come to the nuts and bolts of applying the principles of authenticity, integrity, reliability, and accessibility, you will have to make some decisions. How much processing is enough or even feasible? What level of detail or item-level attention can you give? How will access copies be made available? Will you normalize any file formats or file names, and how will you document your actions? The level of processing depends on the realities of not only your institution's practices and policies, but also your own resources, time, budget, and technology. The time required to process digital files may or may not be equivalent to processing paper records. On the one hand, digital objects do lend themselves to workflows involving batch processes, such as bulk file name changes or migration. Software tools can help you identify and characterize file formats, extract metadata, or identify and weave duplicates. Computer-assisted processing can be applied to very large bodies of records, and activities can potentially be logged automatically. However, there is often the need for more manual processes or intervention, making and documenting appraisal decisions, or other cases of item-level description or processing. Depending on the size of your backlog, you may have more or less time to spend on any one collection. Another matter is staff time. Many institutions do not have the staff time to devote to large, detailed processing projects, and electronic records can often require much more upfront time investment than paper records. Your budget is also a determining factor of your processing setup. Resources vary widely regarding dedicated workstations, legacy media readers, or proprietary software tools. There are more and more open-source tools available to help you accomplish digital processing, but they require the trade-off of your time for research, testing or learning, and chaining tools together. Similarly, depending on the technology available to you, you may or may not have the means of accessing particular formats or media, or have varying levels of expertise on legacy file formats or operating systems. However, you don't need an elaborate setup to do some basic processing, and in the digital world, there is always more to learn about esoteric file formats, obsolete software programs, and the intricacies of various operating system information. Digital processing is never boring and keeps you a lifelong student. We won't go into great detail here as tools change quickly and there are often several that can accomplish a given task. The video series will devote more time to these topics in the future, but we'll talk you through what kinds of tools you can use to achieve archival best practices. Unlike analog processing, digital processing offers the opportunity to leverage the machine readability of your files. Automation or batch processes can speed up the work, and programs may be able to identify something about the records that you can't as easily do. For example, embedded metadata or file signatures. For arrangement and description, the use of hardware or software write blockers can be a key step in your maintenance of integrity and reliability. Write blockers let you view external media but prevent you from accidentally modifying any files on it. You can also create disk images, borrowing technology from the digital forensics field, to preserve the bits of a disk and then analyze or process from there. The very simple method, of course, is to make a copy of files and open those, not the originals, for appraisal purposes. You may also want to use a program to scan for sensitive information that gives you at least a first pass to avoid going file by file. Additional general-purpose tools would be identification of duplicate files, exact duplicates, or fuzzy matches that would at least narrow down the manual work, file format characterization and/or validation, metadata export, bulk file naming, hex editors, and batch scripts. For preservation, some means of checksum generation and validation is a must. Primus standard metadata, tools to convert file formats for access copies or migration, and antivirus programs all help address some of the requirements of the OAIS reference model, ISO 14721, for repositories. Finally, there is an ever-growing list of digital preservation software that wrap these functions into one system. Here are some resources that inform the creation of this video and may be helpful to you as you map out your digital processing policies and workflows. Some have already been mentioned as the intellectual underpinnings of archival work, while others are more practical tools to help you figure out a particular step in the process. This training was produced by the State Electronic Records Initiative in coordination with the Council of State Archivists. The Council of State Archivists is a nonprofit membership organization of the state and territorial government archives in the 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. COSA began the Electronic Records Initiative project in 2012 to address the long-term care and access of electronic records. For additional resources on electronic records preservation and management, please visit the State Electronic Records Initiative webpage.